Now we're going to see the comparison of the attributable risk percent and relative risk reduction. So again, we have our two groups. This is the observational study, the cohort study. Let's say again 400 people on each group. Here this is the exposed group, the unexposed group, Here 80 out of 40 got the disease, here 20 out of 40 got the disease, and here we're talking about a clinical trial. We have 40 in each group. Here 80. This is our intervening group doing a vaccination or giving a new drug, and here placebo or the old drug, whatever. So with the new intervention, just 20 out of 40 out of 400 got the disease, and without intervention, 80 out of 400. So we already saw the attributable risk and the difference in the relative risk. Here remember that the relative risk for antonomacy was the relative risk of the exposed to the non-exposed. So in this case it's easy because I have both denominators the same, so it's just 4. And here the relative risk is, remember that by antonomacy is the intervened group divided by the unintervened group, so here is 1/4 or 25%. Now remember that the attributable risk here is how much risk I can attribute to the exposition. That would be 80 over 400 minus 20 over 400. So this is 60 out of 400. And we saw that it was 0.15. And here we don't talk about attributable risk. This was the attributable risk. We talk about the attributable risk reduction. That is exactly the same. This is how much reduction on risk I can attribute to the intervention. So again, it would be 80 out of 400 minus 20 out of 400. Again, 60 out of 400, 0.15. Alright, now let's see the relative risk reduction and the attributable risk percent. The attributable risk percent is the percent of attributable risk. That is, the attributable risk is how much risk I could attribute to the exposition. This is the ratio of risk that I can attribute to the exposition. So here I'm talking about a ratio. So this is just how much risk I can attribute. This is what's the ratio, or what is the percent of risk that I can attribute. So here the attributable risk is 60 out of 400. This is the attributable risk. This is how much risk I can attribute. Here I'm talking about the ratio. So remember that when I'm talking for us about the percent, I mean here what is the ratio, or what is the percent of risk that I can attribute to the disease. So my numerator is going to be the attributable risk. My numerator is going to be how much I attribute to the to the exposition, and in the denominator is how much risk I could have. Here the word is how much risk I could attribute, and here is the ratio is the attributable risk is how much risk I could attribute to the exposition divided by how much risk I would, right, I would attribute to the exposition. This is Doing the attributable risk, I know that only 60 out of 400 is the risk that I can attribute to the exposition. Just 60 out of 400. So this is my attributable risk. But ideally, what would be the risk that I could have attributed? That is, ideally, I would like that without the exposition, just 0 out of 400 got the disease. And so I would know that all the people that has the disease would be because of the exposition. So in the ideal case, I would like that here the unexposed group 0 out of 400 got the disease. So ideally here the attributable risk would be 80 out of 400. 80 over 400 divided minus 0 out of 400. So ideally I would have 80 out of 400. So my attributable risk percent, that is the ratio of the risk that I can attribute to the exposition, is what is the risk that I attribute? That I attribute is 60 out of 400, and this is divided by how much, or ideally how much risk I could have attributed to the exposition. How much risk? Just 80 out of 400, because ideally here 0 and here, well, I got 80. But if I got 90 here, 90, then it would be 90 out of 400, but I got 80. So ideally just means that this would be 0 out of 400. So my attributable risk percent is 60 out of 80. This is 34, this is 75%. Oh, 0.75, and you multiply by 100 to get 75%. So the attributable risk percent was the rate of disease on the exposed group minus the rate of the disease on the unexposed group. This is the attributable risk, divided by the rate of disease on the exposed group. So I have the attributable risk divided by the rate of disease on the exposed group. Other way to see it is this will be 1, and rate of disease on the unexposed divided by rate of the disease of the exposed. This is the relative risk, but not the relative risk of antonomacy. Remember that in observational studies, the relative risk by antonomacy is the rate of disease of the exposed group divided by the rate of disease on the unexposed group. So this, I would say that is the relative risk. So I have the other way around. So I would put here 1 over the relative risk. So now let's calculate it. What is the relative risk? Remember, the relative risk, I mean the relative risk by antonomacy. The relative risk in this case was 4. So my attributable risk percent would be 1 minus 1/4. It would be 3/4. This is 75%. So that is, we got the same result. Other way to do it is here, instead of divide this by this and then this by this, you could multiply everything by 1 over the rate of disease on the unexposed group divided by 1 over the rate of disease on the unexposed group. Or you could think it as the numerator I'm going to divide over the rate of disease on the unexposed group, and the denominator I'm going to divide over the rate of disease on the unexposed group. So anyway, I would have this rate of disease of the exposed group divided by rate of disease of the unexposed group is the relative risk, minus rate of disease of the unexposed group divided by rate of disease of the unexposed group is 1, divided by rate of disease of the exposed group divided by rate of disease of the unexposed group is the relative risk. Remember that the relative risk means the relative risk by antonomacy, that is the relative risk of the exposed to the unexposed group. That in this case was 4. So I would have 4 minus 1 divided by 4, 3/4 or 75%. So we have three ways of calculate the attributable risk percent, and the attributable risk percent is only for the observational studies, or the cohort study, not the clinical trial. So these two, this and this, are useful when we don't have the complete information, because maybe you just know that the relative risk was 4, the relative risk by antonomy, but you don't know that they were 80 out of 400 or 20 out of 400. You don't know anything about that, so you couldn't calculate the attributable risk and then divide by the rate of disease of the unexposed group, because you don't know what is any one of these. So you just know the relative risk. In case you just know the relative risk, you could use either this formula or this formula. But you see that the formulas are quite intuitive, and just because in the statistical lessons, maybe they just tell us about the formulas, but they don't say why or how they come from. Here on the, I think that most of the times they teach us this, because here maybe it looks a little bit off, or say 1 minus 1 over relative risk, but it's quite the same thing. You can do whatever you want. You just know it's better to try to derivate it and to try to remember, but now you know how the formulas come from, and you have 3 ways of doing it, but most of the time maybe you just have the relative risk, in which case you need to do just one of these 2. Now, and I think that the most important is to know the meaning of attributable risk percent, because I think that most of the time people get confused between attributable risk percent and actually attributable risk percent with attributable risk. Attributable risk is just how much risk, or let's say how much risk I attribute to the disease. I don't want to, in this video, to use the word could, because the word could I'm using like with 2 slightly different meanings in the numerator than in the denominator. So I would say the attributable risk percent is the attributable risk is how much risk I attribute to the disease, and the attributable risk percent is the ratio or the percentage of the risk that I attribute to the disease. This is on the numerator I have how much risk I attribute to the disease, and on the denominator I have how much risk I could attribute to the disease. I could have attributed to the exposition. Sorry, I could have attributed to the exposition 80 out of 400, but I just attribute 60 out of 400. Why? Because this is 20 out of 400 and not 0 out of 400. So for that, the attributable risk percent is the ratio of how much risk I attribute to the exposition. That is how much risk I attribute to the exposition, that is the attributable risk, divided by how much risk I could ideally attribute to the exposition. So in this case, ideally that would be 80 out of 400, but I just attribute 60 out of 400 of that 80 out of 400 that I would like to have attribute, that I can't. So this is the attributable risk percent, and this is used only for the cohort study. Now let's go to the relative risk reduction. The relative risk reduction is the rate of reduction that I can, or that I attribute to the intervention. So what is the rate of reduction that I attribute to intervention? First, what is, well, in order to know this is how much risk reduction I attribute to the intervention divided by how much risk I would like, or I would have attribute to the intervention. I would like that with intervention 0 out of the 400 got the disease. So in the denominator, my ideally would be 80 out of 400. But actually, I could only attribute 60 out of 400 reduction of the risk. So here I have again, this is my attributable risk reduction. Remember that we saw it in the previous video and we calculated here at the beginning. The attributable risk reduction is how much reduction of risk I attribute to the intervention. This divided by the rate of disease on the placebo group. Rate of disease on the placebo group. You see, this is quite the same. Here's attributable risk, and we saw that here is the same as attributable risk reduction. Divided by the rate of disease on the exposed group. Here is divided by the rate of disease on the placebo group. These are the ones that get more the disease. So here, remember that here the attributable risk reduction was the rate of disease on the exposed group. Rate of disease of the placebo group minus rate of disease on the intervened group. This is my attributable risk reduction, and the rate of disease on the placebo group, rate of disease on the placebo group. So this is 1 minus, what is the rate of disease on the intervened group divided by the rate of disease in the placebo group. This was my relative risk. Remember that in the clinical trial, the relative risk by antonomacy is the rate of disease in the intervened group divided by the rate of disease on the placebo group. So for that, I have that the relative risk percent is 1 minus the relative risk, and I have that the attributable risk percent is 1 minus 1 over the relative risk. But if you see, they're quite exactly the same thing, just that in different studies. But the issue is that here you have 1 over relative risk, and here you have relative risk. But this is because by antonomacy, when we talk about relative risk here, we're talking about relative risk. This relative risk means rate of disease of the exposed group divided by relative risk of the unexposed group. And here, relative risk means the rate of disease of the intervened group divided by rate of the disease of the placebo group. Remember that. So here our relative risk is the rate of disease of the uncontrolled group, that is the exposed group, divided by the control group. And here is the same. The relative risk is the rate of disease of the uncontrolled group divided by the rate of disease on the control group. Just that here our uncontrolled group is the intervened group, the one that less often get the disease because of the intervention. And here the uncontrolled group is that most often get the disease because they are exposed to the risk factor. So in a sense, they're the same. These same mechanism of thinking, but the relative risk is different, because here by antonomacy, when we just say relative risk, means exposed over unexposed, and here relative risk means intervened over the non-intervened. But you see that actually I could say that the attributable risk percent is 1 minus the relative risk. Just that here I would need to do the specification that the relative risk, I'm talking about the relative risk of unexposed group to the exposed group. That is the same as here, the same in the sense that I'm taking the less diseased people, that is the group that less often get the disease, to the group that most often get the disease. So the relative risk reduction and the attributable risk percent are quite the same thing. Relative risk reduction is used in the clinical trial. Attributable risk percent is used on the cohort study. And in each one, in the attributable risk percent is what is the percent or what is the ratio of risk that I can, or the risk that I attribute to the disease, and that would be to the exposition. That would be the how much risk I attribute to the exposition divided how much risk I ideally would like to attribute to the exposition. And here is the attributable risk reduction. It would be how much risk reduction I attribute to the disease divided by this, that is the how much risk reduction I would like to have attribute to the intervention. So in this, the relative risk reduction is the attributable risk reduction divided by the rate of disease on the placebo group. That is exactly the same as saying 1 minus relative risk, when relative risk is the relative risk of autonomy, that is the relative risk of intervened group to the placebo group. And here the attributable risk percent is the attributable risk divided by the rate of the disease on the exposed group. That is exactly the same as the relative risk minus 1 divided by the relative risk, or 1 minus 1 over the relative risk. Relative risk here be the relative risk by autonomy, that in this case is the ratio of the exposed to the unexposed. But if you change it, that if you now talk about the relative risk that is of the unexposed to the exposed, you would have 1 minus the relative risk. That is exactly the same that we have here. But here, because we are not talking about the relative risk by autonomy, you here really need to specify that you are talking about the relative risk of unexposed to exposed. You usually don't do this because you are asked to calculate it. So you can calculate it with this, the attributable risk percent. You can calculate it with this way, with this way, or with this way, or with this way. Just when you do the relative risk, be sure that you are doing it not the usual way. That would be the relative risk of the unexposed to the exposed group. And here we would have done exactly the same thing if we switch that this relative risk be the other relative risk. So you would put it over 1 over the relative risk of the placebo group to the intervened group, and then you can multiply this by relative risk of the placebo group to the intervened group divided by the relative risk of the placebo to the intervened group, and you would have relative risk of the placebo to the intervened group minus 1 divided by the relative risk of the placebo group to the intervened group. And this exactly the same shape of formula. The meaning is the issue is just be sure of which relative risk you are using, and so you can use whatever formula you want. You can use this one, this one, this one, or this one. Just that, in a sense, if you think that this is the easiest for you, use it. Just make sure that when you do the relative risk, you do it the other way around that what usually you would have done. And quite the same here, but I think that here you would not like to do this, and here you will be fine just doing 1 minus the relative risk, and here the relative risk could be the usual relative risk, that is the risk of the intervened to the non-intervened. Well, I think that this is enough. We have talking for 23 minutes, but I don't know how to do this shorter. We do another video, but we got to explain here, and it wouldn't be fine if we would have got the video, because the strength of thinking would have been cut.